Hello, this is Professor JPS, and this is Communication Arts 205, Mass Media Popular Culture. This is a video for what would be tomorrow's class on April the 13th. So it's Sunday evening, Easter Sunday evening, April 12th, I think. I guess it's after midnight, so at any rate, I guess it's technically April 13th, but this is a lecture, a streamlined lecture for Communication Arts 205, Chapter 10, Video Games. Now, this is normally what I would do tomorrow in class was I could use your help discussing video games, because as I think many or most of you know, I'm not really that interested in video games. Even as a child of the latter 70s and early 80s, I really didn't play video games. I probably played the least amount of video games of anybody in my neighborhood or anybody in my generation. I was there for the first video games. I was there for Pong when I was a kid, but it never meant too much to me, video games. And it's, in all frankness, it's not something that I know a significant amount about. However, Chapter 10, while I think I've been told by other students in past semesters that Chapter 10 tries to make a nice and decent try at the giganticism and effects of video games in the past 20 years. Some of my students have mentioned to me that some of the work that's been done on some of these academic look-see of video games is a little bit out of date. Be that as it may, the information in Berger in Chapter 10 is interesting, and I want to go over some of Chapter 10 this evening, and maybe we'll do a little more of Chapter 10 on Wednesday. So I think it's worth noting that video games has been taken relatively seriously in communication research over the past decade or so because of just how popular it has become, and also the cultural and psychological questions, notwithstanding the economic questions, that come from so much of the population being so heavily engrossed in video games. In other words, as we discussed before with uses and gratifications method research, I think there's some interesting research into video games in terms of what people get out of them and how much time they're spending on them, and the sociological aspects of team playing and MMOs and first-person shooter games. And there's a lot of interesting dynamic sociological and communication-related questions to the strength of video games, and also the economics of video games. It's amazing to me how much money video games make. They make more money than the movie industry, which is fascinating to me. And in a lot of ways, I think they borrow from the movie industry and have borrowed from the movie industry. So just in terms of some of the aspects that we'll discuss in this lecture tonight, streamlined lecture, we'll discuss some of the aspects of the question of how video games can be conceived or can be received, as either an art form or just a medium. That's an interesting question that Berger poses. A little bit about what are called MMOs, which is multiplayer online community, and also the ideas of what's called a meta-narrative within video games, and something called immersion, transformation, and interactivity, which we'll discuss in the next little while this evening, okay? So in terms of your textbook this evening so far, we'll just be doing from pages 259 through about 266 or 267 or so. The overall chapter is relatively short, and I think it's to the point. So when the time comes, make sure that you read this particular chapter. I think you'll get a kick out of it. I think some students will be dismissive of some of the stuff, and some of the examples are a little bit outdated, but that's just the way it goes in textbook publishing. but they still offer some interesting questions and some interesting insights into the power of video games and what that power could, how that power could be affecting just our society, how people use video games as a substitute in some ways for real life. So Berger discusses this ongoing power and change and how academics have looked at it right on the first page at 259, where he says in the latter paragraph, the last paragraph, video games have clearly evolved considerably, but what they have evolved into is a matter for discussion. The analysis of video games that follows deals with a number of aspects of this relatively recent popular culture phenomenon. I'm old enough to know that when you have a scholar such as Berger discussing video games as a cultural phenomenon, it's come a long way, even to be studied as an academic pursuit. And you guys like video games, so just don't turn your noses up at this idea. I think you should be able to offer some interesting insights, both in terms of any class questions you may have for me on email. First, I deal with the question of whether video games are an art form or a new medium, listing some of the more important genres found in video games and offering examples of each. Then offer comments about how the development of new technologies has affected video games. That is followed by a brief discussion on some insights about video games by Janet Murray in her important analysis of narrative video games, Hamlet on the Holodeck, The Future of Narrative in Cyberspace. That's just a book that had been written 20 years ago or so. And then he addresses the psychological gratifications that video games provide and the ways they, quote, hook, unquote, players. Finally, I discussed the social and cultural impact of video games, including issues of violence and sexuality. We'll talk about violence and sexuality, I think, in the second lecture, probably for Wednesday. But for this evening, I just want to go over some of the introductory aspects of what Berger's trying to get at as an academic looking into something that's, traditionally has not been looked into, but recently has been looked into, the cultural phenomenon that is video games. He first discusses just how much money video games makes. And, I've had this book for a number of years, but, and I'm sure the money's more than what's printed in this book from a few years ago. But it was stunning to me how much money they make. If we count all the money spent on video game playing equipment as well as the games themselves, the video game industry is currently larger than the film industry in the United States. It plays a major role in our daily diet. Daily media diet. Video game is no longer just for children either. A considerable number of video game players are adults. In 2003, which is 17 years ago, Americans spent $6.9 billion on game software and billions more on video game consoles such as Microsoft, Xbox, Sony, PlayStation 2, and Nintendo GameCube, as well as on powerful computers with special chips and audio systems designed for video gaming. In 2009, the total sales of video games and consoles in the United States was $19.6 billion, according to the group NDP. Bloomberg's Business Week carried an article in 2007 by Jesse Scanlon titled "The Video Game Industry Outlook: $31.6 billion and Growing" by PricewaterhouseCoopers accounting firms. In 2017, it is estimated that video games will reach over $100 billion. I mean, that's just astounding. That's astounding. And it can't be just because they're all fun. It has to do with much more than just entertaining oneself. It has to do, I think Berger is trying to say, and I think that some of the things you've learned in this particular class about semiotics and Marxism and psychoanalytic theory and sociological theory, some of that stuff all has to tie into the effect that video games has on the person and the people who are playing it. It must fill some voids that one does not get in, three-dimensional actual reality, that one can pretend and live in an alternate reality. That's an interesting question. And I think that that's what Chapter 10 tries to get at. He starts by listing some of the percentages of particular kinds of games. I think you guys should look on this on page 260. The best-selling video games as of a few years ago, 2016, were 27.5% were shooter games, 22.5 were action games, 12.9 were RPG, 11.7 were sports, 7.8 were adventure, 5.8 were fighting, 4.3 strategy games, 4.1 other, whatever that means, and 3.3 racing games. And they also make the point that there's a good deal of a multiplicity of ways in which video games are played these days. Many video games are available in formats from a number of different platforms, very powerful computers that some gamers use to play video games, but most of the action in the video game industry involves the players created for video games, Xbox 360, PlayStation, and the Wii. And then they talk about a list of the top 20 video games. Perhaps some of you know of these. I'm sure you know of most of them. The top 20 selling games as of 2016. Number 1 was Call of Duty, 2 Battlefield 1, 3 Grand Theft Auto 4, 4 Madden NFL 17, 5 NBA 2K17, 6 The Division, 7 Overwatch, 8 Minecraft, 9 Call of Duty Black Ops 3, 10 FIFA 17, 11 Pokemon Sun, 12 Pokemon Moon, 13 The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, 14 Star Wars Battlefront, 15 Final Fantasy 15, 16 Titanfall 2, 17 NBA 2K16, 18 Rainbow Six Siege, 19 Far Cry Primal, and 20 Dark Souls 3. Now you don't have to write all those down. It was just conversation and just a way to discuss some of the names of these particular video games. I'm sure you've heard of all of them. Most of them, maybe some of them stink. Some of them are great. I don't really know. I've never played any of them. And they've moved from decade to decade. Okay. And Berger makes the point that we can see that aside from Pokemon, sports, warfare, fighting, and violence are common threads in most of the popular video games. One of the more common criticisms made of the video game industry is that the games are too violent and players become desensitized to the real impact. To the impact of real violence on others. I think we'll talk a little bit about that in Wednesday's lecture, or the lecture that would be for Wednesday in terms of video games and violence. But I think that that's been a long-standing idea with people who are relatively critical of video games, because many video games are violent and they have a kind of vicarious thrill that you can act out violence surreptitiously on a video game without actually acting out violently in real life. Whereas some video game enthusiasts would say that's a good thing because people get to kind of blow off steam while playing video games, and other people would say, well, that may be the case, but it also desensitizes the user to actual real violence in real life and real society. And it's an open question that mass communication researchers are looking into all of the time. And part of the reason that, and this is very similar to Hollywood, that so many similar kinds of video games are made is because success breeds other success. Just like in Hollywood, when you see so many of the Marvel kinds of films or superhero kinds of films, they just keep making them because people keep coming to see them. And Hollywood films are very, very expensive to make. They're very, very expensive to produce. They're very expensive to market. And if they keep making, Avengers 3, 4, 5, 6, Spider-Man 17, whatever it is, people keep coming to them. And it's an insurance. They get a good bet for their money. And it's similar with video games. Many video games fail because they're expensive to make. and unless you catch on with people very quickly, they fail. And I think that's why you see some of the video games who are so similar, as Berger points out on page 262. Berger starts talking on page 262 and 263 about called an investigation of MMOs. MMOs, massively multiplayer online games. And he calls them a genre that has distinctive characteristics. And there's a person that he quotes, a person called Timothy Rowlands, who made a 2-year study of MMOs based on playing a game called EverQuest. And Rowlands explains back in 2012, playing MMOs involves paying a subscription fee for about $10 or $15 a month to enter a virtual world. And Rowlands says the following: in these virtual worlds, users assume an avatar, a digital stand-in or customizable character on the screen that allows him or her to interact with the game and other people playing it. In doing so, users become immersed in varying degrees of fantasy world, complete with its own rules, relationships, mythos, and meanings. Moreover, by playing an MMO, users gain access to the game's culture, the web of social I can't say the word. Sociality and entertainment created by the game's producers and players as they negotiate between what is possible and what is desirable in the virtual world. And he goes on to explain that around 16 million people who play MMOs, and their numbers will probably increase because they're now free. And he uses the term mythos, which is important. He argues that MMOs have a mythic quality to them. As he explains, they are mythic and ritualized. At their best, they go as far to offer spaces for existential meaning-making. They are playful. Ultimately, these MMOs are narratives and have a social and political significance. And he goes on to explain that something called a meta-narrative, that what is uniquely interesting about MMOs is what he calls the meta-narrative, M-E-T-A, narrative, meta-narrative, which is a narrative within a narrative within a narrative. This meta-narrative promises falsely and immodestly to finally reconcile all the inconsistencies, contradictions, and tensions of our complex, uncertain, and chaotic world. As such, it is a narrative that has important implications for our understanding of basic questions about society. If we are willing to break immersion, forget for a moment that all action is supposed to happen in a fairy tale world of long ago and far away, we can see that MMOs embody social commentary. Seen through new eyes, we might even notice that MMOs, like EverQuest, have important things to say about the issues of social justice, such as freedoms, fairness, equality, and solidarity. And Berger goes on to suggest that this is a relatively important insight into MMOs, because they're not just completely escapist and have messages about social justice that exist in our preconscious, below the level of our immediate awareness. We can say the same thing about video games in general. They may have a more profound impact on societies than we imagine, for good and for bad. I think what Berger is saying there, along with Terry Rowland, is to get to this idea that what video games offer is something that allows for a certain degree of control by the user. And the control is, in some ways, it's already programmed in, right? But the user feels as though he or she is conquering something, whether it's to get to a new level or whether it's to defeat another foe or play in a team. The MMOs allow for a world that's once removed from actual reality to put a person who may or may not have much control in their own life and have a kind of substitute life that allows for them to live digitally with a degree of prowess, ingenuity, and in fact, a degree of putting things right, with a kind of righteousness to win at whatever the video game is asking them to do. That's a very interesting and strange idea when you think about it. Yet, People play like crazy. People identify with these mythic characters. People identify with an avatar that's not themselves in reality, but a version of themselves on online video games. People have deeper connections with the group of people who are playing MMOs with a high degree of value for that. But it's not real. But it's a very, very interesting tension between the video game maker and the video game user, and this level of control and vicarious thrill. And MMOs are very, very, as you guys know, very, very popular and very, very lucrative. And it would be very curious to see how it is that these things keep going, whether or not they get played out, or whether they become a cliche, or whether or not young people tire of them. It's a very interesting question to see how that will last. I don't know. I tend to come down and think of it in the same ways I think about movies, right? Things that are great about movies, in my view, is that movies can show you something that you've never seen before and make you feel an interest in something that is so different from your own experience. And conversely, and almost in a contradictory way, a really good movie can make you understand how something can be demonstrated to you that is exactly the way it happens in real life and feel so true to life that you can identify with whatever that real thing is and feel its justification in your own life and make you think about your own life, right? Now, those often aren't the same kinds of movies, right? But movies are not real. Movies are, light on a wall that is done with tricks, right? But they're very, very powerful psychologically. And I imagine video games borrow some of the generic aspects from movies as well. But what's different about video games is that video games put you in control. I am not in control of any movie unless I make the movie. And even then I'm not in control, I watch the movie, right? But if you're in a video game, you're in the video game and you're in control and you're playing with other people. And that's a different experience than cinema, although there's some cinematic aspects to video games. And conversely, it's almost also an internal contradiction between video games and the effect they may have on people, because I think it's my understanding that the more realistic a video game looks like, and feels like, the better it is. But it's conversely the opposite of reality. It is not reality. It is a digital thing you're playing in a computer or a phone or an iPad or whatever. It's not reality, even though the more real it looks, the better people enjoy them. Why is that? We have a reality of our own, right? I don't understand, but I'm an old fart. It doesn't mean much. Okay, 263, 264. Whether or not the argument about whether video games are simply just a medium, that is to say, something that conveys communication, like radio or television or film, or whether it is an art form. And it's an interesting idea, and I think that Berger, even though he's an old fart like me, comes on down the side that video games are definitely an art form, and I think that you'll see that on 263, excuse me, 264. He says at the top of 264, the best way to think about video games, I would suggest, is to compare them with novels, especially given that many video games have a strong narrative thrust. Novels use the medium of print, and in the case of graphic novels, print and drawings, to tell various kinds of stories, yes? Within the art form of the novel, there are many different genres, such as mysteries, romances, and science fiction stories, as well as non-formulaic, non-genre stories about individuals and their relationships. There are all kinds of novels, from tough guy mysteries, such as Dashiell Hamnett's The Maltese Falcon, to James Joyce's Ulysses. Video games are similar to novels that they encompass many different genres. Thus, I think it is best to consider video game as an art form. Of course, the distinctive medium of film contains many different genres too, but unlike film, video is a medium that is used for other things in addition to gameplay. J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin use the term form in discussing video games in their book, Remediation, Understanding New Media. And they say, the term computer game covers a range of forms, including violent action games, role-playing and narrative games, erotic and frankly pornographic applications, card games, puzzles, and skill testing exercise and educational software. Some of these forms are clear repurposings of early games. Computer games are delivered on a variety of platforms. The authors use the term remediation in describing the ways in which new media are refashioned from earlier media forms. The concept may help us understand how to categorize video games. It is difficult to classify some games as belonging to one genre or another because many blend two or more genres. I think what he's getting at there is that video games are, obviously they're a medium, just like other forms of communications are a medium. But what he's trying to do is up the ante a little bit in terms of academic research into video games, and suggests through remediation, that is to say, borrowing from other forms, right? Borrowing from mysteries, borrowing from films, particularly films, borrowing from television, that when you remediate, you're actually using media again. You're being influenced by a different medium or a different media. And that allows it a widening, a latitude of breadth and scope of something that's more artistic rather than just entertainment. And Berger is making the point that he thinks that video games have more to offer than just entertainment. Now, in all frankness, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I don't play video games. I don't find them that interesting. Plus, that's just me, right? So my level of authority on this is not as high as perhaps it should be. But part of the reason I'd like to use this chapter is my students teach me about their uses of video games. So, we're not in the classroom. So normally we would talk much more in this lecture, right? The students would really take over and say, well, no, Shields, this game is this, this, and this. And some other people would say, well, no, that game is that, that, and that. And you guys were the ones that have the expertise. So if you want to email me any of that stuff, that would be perfectly fine. But in general, what this chapter is trying to get at is just investigating with academic purpose, with scholastic integrity, the giganticism of this cultural phenomenon known as video games, okay? And the next bit discusses this notion of new technology in video games, which is pretty basic. New technologies that are happening all the time. Video games get better and better. Consoles get better and better. MMOs get larger and larger. So you understand that, and it's over on 264 and 265. And just the last bit for this evening in terms of video games has to do with it's a woman called Janet Murray who wrote a book, a very, very powerful book 20-some years ago about the emerging phenomenon known as video games. It was called Hamlet on the Holodeck, The Future of Narrative in Cyberspace, which was mentioned a few minutes ago. And where she's talking about, Janet Murray is talking about interactivity and immersion. And I think that there's something worth discussing about what these ideas are. Over on 265, Berger is talking about Murray's book. And he says, the stories in narrative video games usually have a branching structure. That is, the player faces choices to be made at various stages of the game, and each choice affects the course of the game, and thus all other choices will need to be made. The possible choices and their outcome all have to be programmed into the game, which means although the player makes a choice, the player's feeling that he or she is in control of the game is only an illusion. Every choice and its attendant consequence has already been placed in the story by the programmer, writers, and artists who created the game. Now, I would imagine that you're familiar with that. I imagine that you understand this, right? That even though during the game, whatever game it is, a player is offered choices to make, and those choices affect how the rest of the game is played, giving the player the illusion of control in this fantasy universe that the player is working diligently to best or overcome or succeed. But it's already been programmed into it. It's already been programmed into whatever choice is made by the computer programmers of the games. So it's not really a choice in the same sense that a choice you make in real life affects the way you live your real life and the relationships you have, the jobs you have, the how your actions will be rewarded or not rewarded in real life. A video game is all the choices are already programmed in anyway. Okay, doesn't make it less fun, doesn't make it less interesting, doesn't give you a little bit of a high when you're doing the game, but you're really already been controlled by the game itself. And that's something that's kind of interesting. Interactive video games have the effect of immersing players, immersing, immersing players into simulated environments, surrounding them with alternate realities. When we play these games, we tend to experience the same thing we do when we become fully engrossed in novels or movies. That is, we become, quote, lost, unquote, in the worlds they create. We experience what the English poet and critic Samuel Taylor Coleridge described as the willing suspension of disbelief. When we suspend disbelief, we forget that we are seeing a play, watching a film, or playing a game, and we start identifying with various characters in the story we are being told. Willing suspension of disbelief is a big thing in novels and in films and so forth, right? So if you're watching a movie and you're really into it and you really like the character and it makes you cheer or it makes you cry or whatever, you're letting yourself forget that this is all false and fake, right? But if you're doing that when you're watching a movie or a play or reading a book, it's just you and the movie or the book or the play. You do that in a video game, you're responsible for what's going on in the video game, although you're not really, right? Because it's already been programmed by the programmers of whatever choice you make, and 16,000 different ways it'll happen. What will change is already been programmed in, right? But that's not how it feels when you're playing the game. When you're playing the game, you feel like something is at stake. That's what they mean in fancy words of saying immersing yourself within the realm of the game. Similar to if you're really into a movie, or if you're really into a book, or really into a play, or whatever, okay? So immersion is taking part of yourself and feel as though you've lost yourself into the aspects of the game, whatever the video game is, okay? That you yourself are distant from the actual real reality that you're living in. And you become lost into the game, which I'm sure that's part of the fun of it, right? Because, you know, reality is a pain in the neck and hard, and you got to pay bills and deal with people and, you know, eat the right foods and, brush your teeth or whatever, right? But video games, you feel like you're the master of your own choices. When in reality, you're not. You're just part of the program, okay? It's interesting to note that reviewers of video games also mention the willing suspension of disbelief when they describe games. They have the ability to capture players' attention and make them forget they are playing a game. When we play video games, however, we take a much more active role than we do when we read novels, review films, or television programs. Right. We provide what Murray calls agency. Agency. This is one of those 50-cent college words that you can use when you leave NCC and go off to your 4-year school. Agency means, in this instance, a sense of satisfaction that the player gains from making decisions and taking actions in playing the game, right? So if you have the ability to first be into the game, and then you become lost in the game, and you become good at the game or interested in the game, and the game itself starts to pull you in hours and hours and hours at a time, that's immersion. Agency is the sense of satisfaction you get from beating the game or doing well in the game, right? Whatever it is that you do well, if you play Madden football or 2K basketball or whatever those things are, it gives you a sense of power, dignity, satisfaction. Agency is just a sort of college-leveled word that makes it sound smart, right? It makes you feel like you've overcome something, okay? So immersion and agency are the two key points here. Murray suggests that the creators of storytelling video games must deal with two opposing poles. One involves the narrative elements that generate pleasure in players, as for example, when they solve problems or succeed in a quest. And others involve the satisfaction derived from contest-winning elements of a game. According to Murray, video games give players pleasure in 3 ways: through immersion, agency, and through the last one, transformation, okay? Transformation. Depending upon the game, players can transform themselves into a variety of different roles, such as fighters, car thieves, adventurers, football players, and space heroes, okay? So, immersion is getting lost into the game and really, really, really enjoying it. Agency is having a sense of satisfaction by winning or succeeding at a game. And transformation is part of how it's you pretending to be other people all the time in these video games, right? Now, I laugh only because I don't know anything about that, right? I've never played those games. I've never been interested in them, right? I mean, reality I find interesting and difficult enough. Perhaps if there's a video game where I could become a professor who gets nicer cardigans and maybe my hair were turned brown, maybe I'd have agency and I'd get lost in the game. I don't know. But as of age 56, they just don't mean much to me. But that's neither here nor there. Murray explains, storytelling can be a powerful agent of personal transformation. The right stories can open our hearts and change who we are. Digital narratives add another powerful element to this potential by offering us the opportunity to enact stories rather than to merely witness them. Enacted events have a transformative power that exceeds both narrated and conventionally dramatic events because we assimilate them as personal experiences. Now, that little quote on 266 is just a fancier and more well-written version, excuse me, of what I had to say about, excuse me, pardon me, what I had to say about a little while ago about the difference between enjoying a film and being a spectator and being an active person in a video game, okay? When you're watching a film or television or reading a novel, you're not active. I mean, you're not active, but you're not active like you are in a video game because I'm not responsible for what happens on the screen. I can't change the movie. But in a video game, one does have a certain degree of responsibility to move the narrative along, move the game along, okay? So there are stories in video games, but there's responsibility of the player to make the action happen. That's different than viewing other genres or other media, okay, or other mediums, okay? Experience an immersive environment in which one plays an active role, making decisions that matter, that is, having agency, is so powerful that certain video games have been found to be effective tools for psychotherapy. How about that? Certain video games, because they give people a degree of satisfaction, or even used in certain forms of psychotherapy. They don't say which forms of psychotherapy. I'd like to know that, but that's an interesting idea that I was surprised by. However, there is, however, an element of danger here. It seems that the gratification video games player derive from being immersed in different worlds of their own choosing, from gaining a sense of agency and power, and from transforming themselves, if only for a short while, into whatever they want to be, are very powerful. So powerful that, in fact, video games can be addictive for many people. Well, of course, right? So, anyway, that's where I think we'll leave it off for tonight. That's about halfway through the chapter. Stick to the pages again, and just what I've read out to you has to do, the key things have to do with just how much money video games have been making, how children don't play them. It's not just children anymore; it's adults, and how powerful they are. The prevalence and power of MMOs, the meta narrative, how video games are an art form, and interactivity, immersion, and immersion, transformation, and agency. Those are important ideas for this portion. Okay. I hope you had a good religious Easter weekend and Passover just a few days ago. I hope that you're really doing your best with this COVID stuff. Please make sure that you're being very diligent. No kidding. You have to be really, 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 really diligent. Okay. I've had a few students who have had it. So far, so good. They're coming through okay. God bless. Thank God. Not out of the woods by any means, but it does seem like social distancing is working here in the Northeast. It's worked in California and Seattle, but we still have a long way to go. So please, be very careful with everything. In terms of school stuff, just the key thing for me, even if you're late with stuff, that's okay, but you just have to stay in touch with me. And please, 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 make sure that you're answering your NCC emails or looking at your NCC emails. I don't have everyone's personal email. I don't have that. All I have are what the NCC banner lists have, and it's just your NCC email address. So for those of you who have already linked your personal email to your NCC email, I'm sorry to say this over and over and over again, but it's really, really important that you do that you try to find out how to do that, to make sure that you're linking your personal email to your NCC email. That way, every NCC email you get will come to your personal email account, okay? That's really important. Keep following the syllabus for this class, because what we will do toward the end of the class is soon we will have, toward the end of April and beginning of May, will be more class presentations. And it'll be the same thing like we did this past time. And then there'll be a final, okay? So it's class presentations, then final for the next round. So just keep that in mind. Look at your syllabi, email me, just identify who you are. This is John Smith, Jane Smith, COM 205. This is my question. Please don't just say, Shields, I need an answer to this because I'm not sure who you are. And I have over 100 students in 5 classes, so I need to know who you are when you're emailing me, please. Also, guys, it's real important that we do pre-registration for the fall. I mean, I know it seems weird. I know you're not used to doing this stuff at home, and that when you come to class that I'll say this stuff, but we don't have that. Hopefully we'll all be back to school by the fall. I think we probably should be, but I don't know 1,000%. But it's real important to make sure that we have decent pre-registration numbers in the spring for the fall. So email me and I will get back to you. I will do Zoom meetings. I will call you on the phone if you give me a phone that works. And by the way, clean out your cell phone voice mailboxes, please. Please. I mean, so many of students, their voice mailboxes either haven't been activated or they just haven't cleaned them out forever. At any rate, I'm happy to go through what I can. The first thing you should do is look at your degree evaluation to see where you stand, okay? And sometimes the degree evaluation counts different categories in a weird way, but I'll do my best to make sure that you have a working sense of what it is that you need for the fall semester. I'm also teaching a summer film studies course. Now, I don't know if it's going to go, but it's being offered. It's all through June. It's like 3.5 weeks, and it's a film studies class, so you watch a lot of films. Now, I think it's probably still going to be online. I don't know for sure, but I normally pay for donuts and bagels for people on Thursdays. I won't be able to do that this year. Perhaps I could get you a gift card or something. I don't know. But it looks like the summer classes, at least the first summer session, is going to be all online. But if you want to sign up for it, it's a 200 level class. If you need a 200 level class, it's film studies. You watch movies, you get credits. I talk. It'll just be more compressed and much more quick online, I think, this summer. But the real important thing is to make sure that you're definitely you don't wait to sign up for classes for the fall. It's real important. Two things are real important about it. One, obviously we need numbers. We need numbers, and God knows what the economy is going to be looking like in the summer into the fall. But also, on the other side of that argument, there could be more people coming to NCC because the economy is going to be kind of bad for at least another 3 or 4 months. It could be that a lot of parents in Connecticut are going to say, no, Junior, you're not going to UConn or WestConn or, I don't know, away to college. You're going to take some, your English and your math and your science and your communication classes at NCC for a year. So it almost might even be more crowded. I don't know. I really don't know. But all I know is we can pre-reg. We can do it online, right? You can do it online. It's just don't just blow it off because it's already April. It's already the middle of April. Okay, we would be doing this right now if it were normal times. But we can do it. We can do it online. You can get your stuff done online for the fall semester, okay? I will have another lecture for you Tuesday night into Wednesday, finishing up this chapter. Have a good day, and please, please stay safe. Bye-bye.